Hello and welcome to the What If We Think Differently podcast. My name is Nontsegele Nzula, and here we reimagine our realities. Today I am joined by Dr. Marisa, and this is the second part of us discussing an incredible book, a piece of work here that has so much detail and is worth reading. It is called The Shifts in the Land and Agrarian Question in Africa by Tendai Marisa. In case you're not seeing it over there, I thought just to bring it a little closer to the camera for you. There we have it. Doc, this really is an incredible book that you've written here. The amount of detail, the amount of information that I have found here is mind-blowing to me in particular, because this is not something I would read ordinarily.
Didn't you read it because you have to do this?
I did, but now I'm seeing how much it affects me as a citizen of Zimbabwe, but also as a citizen of Africa. This really here is a mind-opening book, and I would ask you to get a copy, right? Just to get a little more informed and see how land affects you as a citizen. So, Doc, let's get into it. I would just like to bring people up to speed. So in our last episode, we spoke about the land and agrarian question. What is and what does it cover? And in essence, we said it covers the redistribution of land, the ownership of land, the use of land as well, particularly post-colonial times within Africa. And then we made a difference between the agrarian question or land and agrarian question just in general, and then what it means for us now in the 21st century. Then we also looked at how does land affect us as citizens and how your citizenship is tied to the ownership of resources and land. And then we spoke about how the land grab and how it has progressed over time. You spoke about, well, the book actually talks about 4 cycles, and you took time to actually walk us through those cycles. And so now we are coming to another part of the book, right? And we are now looking at Africans' agency. What do we need to do now that we have highlighted the problem? We have looked at our history. Where are we, and what do we need to do to fix the problem?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that recap. I think you've just done justice. I needed it as a summary. So I think when you're exploring African agency, may I start off with a quote from one of my favorite scholars, the late Sameh Amin. I noticed in the book they said Samin Amin. Achieving the agricultural revolution should be the priority target for the decades to come. This was in 1987. I would say what he said here, Egyptian scholar, but with a Pan-African footprint, spent a lot of time at Codesria and also just based in Dakar, Senegal. And Samir contributed largely to our understanding of African realities and also how different sub-regions of Africa are affected by colonialism and they're trying to recover. So in this 1987 piece, he talks about the issue around focusing on achieving the agricultural revolution, being the priority target for the next decades. So this was in the 80s. You do not stop when you have not achieved the goal. So we've not yet achieved the agricultural revolution. So I'll start off by talking about what it looks like. When your share of the population is increasingly working in the manufacturing sector, the urban economy, manufacturing services, and this is larger than the one that is working in agriculture. You would have achieved the agricultural revolution. Yeah, and I want to combine this, if you are able to produce food for yourselves.
Right.
So those are the two combinations. So because we have not yet managed to achieve the migration of people into formal sector jobs, most of our people in Africa, think about this urbanization. Others dismiss it and say, this is not the urbanization we saw in Europe. The urbanization we saw in Europe was organized. People were getting into jobs, etc., etc. Here, people come to the city to spend time idling away on the streets begging, selling airtime, doing petty things or petty crime. That cannot be seen as urbanization that is driven by the development of the urban sector. It's actually fleeing from the rural landscape, which is in its own struggling to nurture sustainable livelihoods. So this is not what we envisaged when we're talking about the shift from the rural to the urban. So now you want us to talk about agency, right? So I think first in the book, I look firstly at what is happening at an African level. then I also give a case study of Zimbabwe as a case study of urgency in terms of trying to resolve this. So we can discuss that. I don't know how you want us to discuss it. Should we start with Africa?
Let's start with Africa, then we'll bring it down to Zimbabwe.
Okay. So Africa, I think Africa, I would say, woke up with the Maputo Declaration of 2003. In that declaration, African governments gathered in Maputo at an AU meeting, agreed to commit 10% of their budgets towards agricultural development. 10%. Because at that moment, you realize that in the background, governments were were spending as little as 2%. 2%, some of them 0.75% on agriculture. Agriculture was now forgotten. They had totally forgotten about the impetus. So you may ask, what pushed this? So I'll say that even in 2003, the Maputo Declaration did not get, there was no movement. Because remember, the AU, what it can do is to propose guidelines. So this is best practice to say, best practice would be that each government allocates 10% of its national budget towards agriculture. But when they go back home, some governments don't implement that. Until 2006, 2007, into 2008, where food riots, we have a major food shortages, food prices go up, etc. That's when people begin to realize, that's when we actually begin to see people remembering Maputo, 2003. We begin to see, and like I said in the previous episode, one of the leading countries in terms of implementing the 10% plus was Malawi, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana. These were the sort of the countries that were ahead of many, but Malawi more importantly, because Malawi had a tighter agricultural development plan that was anchored around this 10%. They began to increase allocations towards extension. They began to increase subsidies around access to treated seeds and access to fertilizer. So this is what is happening. The AU is pushing this. Out of that, they come up with a program called the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program that is housed somewhat in NEPAD. NEPAD then is based in Midrand, South Africa. And then they begin to develop guidelines of monitoring how governments are implementing the 10%. But it's just not a 10%. There are 4 objectives. I think the first one was to increase the area under irrigation, irrigable land. Because with climate change, we recognize that rainfall is becoming erratic. So one of the sustaining innovations that you can say you want to keep production up is to increase the land that is not just dependent on rain-fed agriculture, but you increase irrigation. The other one is around increasing extension support. The other one had to do with access to improved seeds, etc., etc. So related to that, when we talk about African agency, related to the AU initiative around CADIP, 10%, etc., is alongside there emerges a new, seemingly non-profit, but AU-supported infrastructure called the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, supported with initial funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation. And after some time, one of our own philanthropists, Strive Masiwa, also puts his 10 million there to support again. And Agra, in terms of programming, aligns with the CADIP objectives. And the 2003 declaration is renewed in Malabo in 2013 after a review and a commitment to say, we have seen, based on experiments that we have seen in other countries, the allocation of 10% is contributing towards something. There is actually something that I write somewhere to say is the 10% stupid. Just to say that if you're allocating consistently 10%, you can achieve something. But there are many other issues that this form of agents, of this framing around the solutions ignores. The first one, it ignores the land question totally. Does not deal with skewed land ownership patterns. It sort of ignores them, does not address them. It just assumes that if we implement these reforms at this level, we'll achieve the desired effects without dealing with the constraints to do with customary tenure, without dealing with the constraints of redistribution of land, without dealing with the constraints of congestion in certain raw areas. So for many of us, we're outsiders watching both processes unfold. That was our criticism, to say, you cannot fix the agrarian question the way you're trying to look at it without fixing the base of production, which is the land question. So in many instances, that was the challenge with the agents. We felt like African Union and related institutions were being polite. They did not want to tamper with colonially embedded injustices, especially in South Africa, which was really burning at that moment, Namibia and Zimbabwe. Because these are countries that could not fix the agrarian question without dealing with redistribution of land, and Kenya too. So we felt like that needed to be resolved, and also broadly across countries that had gone through what you call non-settler colonialism, the forms of land tenure there are inimical to growth.
So we still can't run away from the issue of land and redistribution. It is showing up still in the news, within our lives, right now in 2026, and you are talking in the 80s.
Yeah.
And so we're exploring now, we've looked at the African aspect or the context of Africa and the land and agrarian question and the agency that then happened or is happening. Let's move it to Zim. You have Zim here as a case study around the land tenure question and how that has worked out. Could you just share a little more about that?
Yeah, but if you may indulge me,
Sure.
just to finish off a trail of sort of some thinking I was doing. We examined at Seville, through what you call the agriculture tracker, we examined the role of the 10%,
Right.
if it was leading to any positive developments. So we saw agriculture output increase or double in countries like Malawi, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Ghana. And these were 10% countries. These were countries that were consistently allocating 10% over more than just one budget, but consistently. So we began to make that argument to push. So in my previous job, I was supporting the emergence of an advocacy movement for the 10%, to say governments need to allocate 10%. They need to align with CADIP. So it was for every country that we were seeing allocate this, despite the structural challenges I've mentioned, we're seeing some changes. The need was moving in a certain way. And it's still moving in countries that can consistently allocate. But the challenge is you now have to face the issue that if you're allocating 10% in Malawi and Kwacha, you need to convert that so that you can buy inputs from other countries. Forex can be an issue, etc., etc. Now, coming back to Zimbabwe, the country that we reside in, the country that I call home, land has been one of the most sensitive issues. It has created polarization across extreme levels. So there are many others who believe right now that Zimbabwe is a basket case. And Zimbabwe is a basket case because they took land from those who were able to use it. The large-scale commercial farmers were largely white. So that's the narrative everywhere you go. When you say I'm from Zimbabwe, so, oh, Mugabe messed up a beautiful country. You see now. But I think, in as much as at times I don't have time to argue because I'm at the airport, somebody's telling me this, I just walk past. But the evidence, the data that we have collected is showing us something totally different. Totally different. There's something that has happened with land reform. Despite its own challenges, I argue that the land reform program in Zimbabwe remains incomplete. That's an argument I make. There would be need for another round of reallocating land sizes because some of the farms are too big for the kind of capacity that the farmers have. You know what I mean? So you find somebody sitting on 100 hectares, but they're only using 10. You know what I mean? So there's need for a thorough resizing of land sizes based on capacity and also natural region. So that's one that is outstanding. But let me look at what has happened. Land was taken from approximately 4,500 large-scale commercial farmers and redistributed to 160,000 A1 farmers. A1 farmers get 6 hectares each. Then they can, if it's individual households, then they get what they call common grazing land. So 160,000, if you add that, an average size of a family is 2 or 4, you can add how many people benefited. Then there's what they call the commercial model, which was the A2. The A2, the smallest size is 20 hectares, but it can go all the way to 300, 400 hectares, depending on natural region. Those who are in the drier regions were getting larger scale, larger pieces of land so that they could engage in cattle ranching and other activities. So when we look across the board in terms of what has happened to production, so we're seeing recovery across almost all crops since the turn of the century. So yeah, it's not me, it's the data. The FAO data. The CNN came to Zimbabwe and did a documentary on what they called the Zimbabwe wheat miracle. Just looking at how a country that was naturally a net importer of wheat was now able to produce wheat that is close to sustainable. That's one. Then we've seen recovery again in tobacco. Big way. Actually, we're now producing more tobacco than we produced before land reform. Yeah? Then we're beginning to see recovery across the maize crop. So all these are recoveries that we're seeing. Albeit, there are so many challenges. I'm not just trying to whitewash the challenges to say there's still contestations around the transfer of land. Those who lost land are still fighting to at least to be compensated. I 100% support the compensation agenda. They should be given the compensation. Because the agreement, which I sort of agree with under President Mugabe, was we are compensating for improvements on land, not for the land. I think it's fair. People spent their lifetimes investing on that land. So if it's compensating and it's properly, adequately sort of computed, etc., they should be compensated. So that's one of the outstanding issues. And the second outstanding issue is actually the manner in which these people hold land.
Right.
Yeah? The government of Zimbabwe since last year has been trying to deal with the privatization of tenure. And in the privatization of tenure, they are targeting mostly A2 farmers and even some A1s to give them title, etc., etc. I've written a piece about this within the book and outside the book where I talk about the fears of land concentration. And also how the privatization of land tenure, number one, can contribute towards a compensation fund. Because if everyone was benefited from land, I can assure you that this is unheard of in many countries, that overnight you can wake up and you have 100 hectares, from 0 to 100, for free. And that land, you're going to use it productively for your private gain. You're not producing for the country. It's for your private gain. When you produce tobacco, the money that hits your account is your money. So on the basis of that argument, that it's for your private gain, this is not a government that has taken land and said it's now going to be farmed by ADA, the national parastatal. This is land that is going to be farmed by non-C, by whoever got the land. So my argument was to say, these farmers that have received land should contribute to the compensation fund. So you issue what you call a lease tax. And a lease tax is set at a certain amount and paid over a certain period. So if you want, you can say lease, it's a hire to purchase or lease to purchase. So if you consistently pay your lease fees over 10 years, that land is transferred to you eventually. You get a title deed that says, this land is unencumbered, no one can bother you, you can sell it, you can do whatever you want with it. That helps with inheritance, because some people who got land have unfortunately gone on to be with the Lord. And they have children who don't want to come to Zimbabwe and farm. So some of the land is already lying idle. So if you do that, you create now a clean way of making sure that land is transferable. But also you resolve this issue that is currently inhibiting investment into Zimbabwe. Because many countries are standing and watching how Zimbabwe will deal with this issue. Because remember, in capitalism, property rights, there's what we call sanctity of property rights. Anyone who wants to come and invest in your country checks out your history, your trend in how you treat property rights. Right. A company cannot come and say we're setting up a large-scale agro-business in a country that has a history of them just grabbing that. So the compensation will go in a long way of assuring investors that Zimbabwe is ready for business. It's just not a rhetorical statement. You have to show practical steps to say, this is how ready we are for business. So this compensation claim is around 3.5 billion. With this taxation system that I'm proposing, I think we can get that money within 3-4 years. And we can pay off farmers. And I believe, and this is the argument we make, that everyone who associates with Zimbabwe in one way or the other should have access to land. They should then be able to go and purchase land on the open market. So that's the issue with Zimbabwe. Production has happened, more could be done, but we still have this thing hanging over our heads around, is this complete? Are people going to be compensated, or people will be given their land back?
Right, so your concluding chapter says what must be done. It's a simple and straightforward question. What must we do? And I'd like to just read something here. It says the premise being Africa already lags other regions in terms of resolving its land and agrarian question. Many have recommended a catch-up approach where the continent only needs a copy and paste what others have done. We suggest an alternative framework. What if, the What If podcast, what if rather than pursuing a catch-up approach, Africa instead embarks on an alternative path driven by existing strengths and opportunities? Tonight, I'm so glad that I'm sitting next to you. Then I can ask you this question.
Yeah.
You highlight these strengths. What if we focus on an alternative path, focusing on existing strengths and opportunities? What are those existing strengths and opportunities that Africa has?
Or if it's a quiz, I'll fail because I can't remember what I wrote. Yeah, but I think for me, there are two strengths or three. The first strength for us is we've got more arable land than anyone else. That's a huge advantage. If you're really looking at assets, that's one. Then number two, we have an abundance of labor, a real abundance of labor. And number three, climate still favors agricultural production in Africa. Then number four, if you really look, the world is moving towards non-GMO food, organic food, etc. It's a niche. It's a real niche. And yet, the real risk, many Africans are being absorbed into global synthetic fertilizer chains and chemicals. But if you look at that, that's actually has been the constraint to agricultural development. Because unlike other countries that have gone a long way in terms of adapting fertilizers, it's because they manufacture it. We are being asked to adapt to synthetic fertilizers, yet Africa's capacity or global output of fertilizer, if I'm not mistaken, is less than 25%. So the deficit we import, treated seeds owned by 5, 6, 7 companies that have got patents. So the moment you are locked into those production patterns, every year, if you are using hybrid seed, you can't reuse those seeds. You have to buy new seeds. The moment your land has tested synthetic fertilizers, it's difficult to regenerate it to have its own micronutrients. You're now dependent. So every year you are increasing the amount of fertilizer you are applying. So you are locked in to synthetic fertilizer global firms. You are not dependent on them. But if the alternative, if we're to break away and pursue based on what we have, naturally occurring materials or minerals. If you want to lime your land, you use your gypsum, it's naturally occurring, etc., etc. How do you then move into organic agriculture? It's bastardized in many spaces. Scientists sort of look down upon organic agriculture. But we have seen pockets that are beginning to convince us that there is a future in combining organic agriculture with some level of synthetic fertilizers, and you reduce your dependence and the cost of synthetic fertilizers. But you begin, and it's much more nutritious. One thing that has always surprised me is when I have colleagues who come from the global north and they visit, they test the beef. I'm sure you saw Aisho Speed. He tested Zimbabwean beef. He tested beef in South Africa. Oh, this is beautiful beef. This is good tasting beef, etc. Why? Because it's produced differently. Our beef just eats in the veldt. Theirs is industrially produced. Our food quality, every colleague that I've had come, so this food tastes different. So I think even the world, the developed world, has forgotten the natural taste of food. This is what Africa can offer. But the challenge of Africa is we are so preoccupied with primary production and limited value addition. So we need to really think about the next step of production. So first of all, we need to be thinking about what are the alternative inputs to our agriculture, our production? How do we create our own seed banks? There's a movement called the Rural Women's Assembly. And there's also a food fair that happens in Harare, and it's a Pan-African food fair, where there's an exchange, communities exchanging seeds, pumpkin seed, groundnut seed, etc., etc. We need to scale that, because the challenge with us, we don't have our own seed banks. We're dependent on private companies' seed banks. And seed is the much critical input into agriculture. So if we don't fix seed and we don't fix fertilizers, we are lost. That's it. Then number two, Africa, before we even talk of export markets that are outside of Africa, Africa needs a strategy of feeding itself and beginning to trade amongst ourselves as African countries. There's very limited intra-African trade compared to trade with other partners. So our natural environments give us strengths in different ways. Some have strengths to produce fruits, some have strengths to produce cereals, some have strengths to produce this. But if we begin to trade amongst ourselves, we begin to move and we reduce our import bill.
Right.
You see now, that's the way we can begin to fix the agrarian question. And we begin to also agree on nodes or hubs of production of something. So if we say in the SADC we have a challenge of seed sovereignty, what is the SADC strategy that can permeate entire SADC countries? Does it mean that every country needs to have a seed factory? What if we allocated that responsibility to 1 or 2 countries, the same with fertilizers, etc.? So I think what we're missing is that strategy that coheres a framework for us to de-link from our dependence on the international global supply chain.
Incredible. So I'm going to read a section here. It says, at the center of rethinking a new model are questions such as, what kind of rights do people have over land? 2, what forms of access to other natural resources such as water exist? And also, the extent to which relations with market-based players can be restructured, for instance, in the area of agricultural inputs, to enable the producers to develop their own supplier chains of seed through community-owned seed banks.
I think you have just whetted the reader's appetite. Anyone would want to read this based on that. Honestly speaking, I think during the break we're talking about how fixing the agrarian question is at the center of resolving the African question. I strongly believe this, and I'll cite examples. For South Korea to be where it is today, it had to embark on thorough land reforms and fix its agrarian question. Japan, China. Many countries have had, because, we're trying to jump a stage. We're trying to be smart to jump a stage. But I think the results keep on showing that we need to go back to grade 3. Because we jumped a stage, we jumped a class.
Okay.
Africa really needs to revisit the rural question. And in the absence of a strategy, we are dancing on the same spot. Because even the money that we're supposed now to be having as a surplus. So for instance, you may say you had a surplus in gold trade. Where does that money go to? You end up importing food.
Yeah.
There was a time when I met up with the then Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe, and he says to me, do you know the biggest driver of foreign currency utilization in our country is the importation of flour, wheat. Yeah?
That's very sobering.
So this is not unique to Zimbabwe. If you go to West Africa, the amount of rice they import will scare you. Yeah? So we make it look so easy because we're trying to feed people in the cities and we don't want food riots. So governments subsidize this on money they don't have. So their debts keep on accumulating. So for us to really fix Africa, we need to produce enough food and to feed ourselves first. Once we are there, we can begin to contemplate the more sophisticated questions. Feed yourself first.
Feed yourself first. And as we draw close to the closure of this particular episode, this is my last read, I promise. It says, the task at hand is to strengthen smallholder-led agriculture. As already stated, the majority of Africa remains rural, suggesting the dominance of smallholder agriculture as the main economic activity. Yet, it brings in so little and many have remained in poverty. Pathways out of poverty have rarely been through smallholder agriculture.
Rarely. I've talked in another episode about how my village remains the same from the time I was a little kid up until now. But I'm not saying my people are lazy. They are some of the most hardworking people I know. But it's just the manner in which agriculture is organized there in customary tenure and governments insisting that people produce controlled crops like maize and they are then paid later, the payments are delayed, etc. And their production is not autonomous. They have to wait for government to give them inputs. So I think we've made cannon fodder or political fodder of our rural people. They are the best for many liberation movements, many dominant political parties. And the reason why they are the best is when you summon them, you say, we're going to give you maize, we're going to give you this. So as long as our politicians feed off our people in terms of getting votes, I don't see this happening because the rural remains underdeveloped and it's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy that has been developed by political elites to keep them subjects and not to liberate them. Because they know once they liberate them, the political equation in Africa will change.
I love how you've linked this land and agrarian question to the question of democracy, the African question, the question on development. So as we come to a close, Tendai, do you have any closing remarks?
Read the book. Let me just read what a friend of mine wrote about this book. It's one sentence, but it's long. But let me read it. This wide-ranging, historically grounded and incisive critique of global, regional, and national land, agrarian and agri-food systems, policies, and the solutions proposed are a timely reminder that Africa's future hinges on addressing these questions in ways that are just, equitable, and attend to the repair of the planet. So I wish many of us engaged grappling with the questions of development could return to trying to resolve this. Because what I'm sensing is that there's fewer and fewer scholars who are interested in this subject. And yet, for many of us, we believe that Africa's takeoff is dependent on her resolving her agrarian question. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Tendai. You can get yourself a copy of this book on the website that has the name of the book, Shifts in the Land and Agrarian Question in Africa. So, Tendai, thank you so much for this book. It's such a beautiful read, and it won't take you that long. It's actually not a long book. From what I read, it is 137 pages only. The chapters are very short, but very insightful.
It's a good weekend read. Yeah.
And you can get all the subjects that we spoke about in depth in the book. If you've never encountered the land and agrarian question, this is a great place to start. So thank you for joining us for this episode of the What If We Think Differently podcast. My name is Nontsegele Nzula. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye for now. To subscribe, you can look for What If We Think Differently on Spotify. You can also look for What If We Think Differently on Apple Podcasts. On YouTube, you will find us on CVO TV. To stay up to